What's going on, fellas? As someone who has Sicilian and Italian roots, I've always been fascinated by the Mafia. Most of you have probably heard of them through movies such as The Godfather, Raging Bulls, Goodfellas, and some less appealing films. However, it may or may not come to your surprise that most of these movies are not historically accurate to the American Mafia, so I decided to do my own research and figure out what the mob was really like. This is the history of the American Mafia. The Mafia itself started in Sicily when different groups of criminals began to kill and steal for their own personal gain. The first member of the Mafia to immigrate to America was Giuseppe Esposito. He and 6 other Sicilians fled to New York after murdering the Chancellor and Vice Chancellor of a Sicilian province of 11 wealthy landowners. He moved to New Orleans in 1880 and began to associate himself with Italian big shots, changed his name, bought a boat, and acted like a fisherman. On October 15, 1890, New Orleans Police Superintendent David Hennessy was murdered execution style. Hundreds of Sicilians were arrested and 19 were charged with murder. An acquittal generated mass rumors that the jury was being bribed and witnesses to the crime were being intimidated. The outraged citizens of New Orleans organized a lynch mob and 11 of the 19 accused were killed. 2 were hung, 9 were shot, and the remaining 8 escaped. Giuseppe was caught by authorities sometime in 1891 and was extradited back to Italy. But because of his presence and hard work, New Orleans and New York became new hotbeds for organized crime. This organized crime would continue to gradually build up in populated areas until a massive opportunity was placed right in front of it: Prohibition. On January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed, which began the era of Prohibition. The production, transportation, and consumption of alcohol was made illegal. This, coincidentally, was the period of time where waves of Italians came to America in search of a better life and new opportunities. In New York City alone, by 1910, there were about 500,000 Italian immigrants living in the slums and streets. And as new Italian leader Benito Mussolini cracked down on mafia activities in Italy, more mafia members began to move to America. Before Prohibition, mafia members took part in activities such as gambling, extortion, and prostitution, but after Prohibition was passed, they began to illegally sell alcohol and make a massive profit. This is when different mafia groups, or as they're known as now, families, began to form. These new-founded families used their power to employ members, get lawyers, and take over areas of a city. By the end of the 20s, 2 primary factions had emerged in the Italian criminal groups in New York. Joe Masseria, who controlled the group, sparked the so-called Castellamarese War in 1928 when he tried to gain control of organized crime across the country. The so-called war ended in 1931 when Salvatore Maranzano conspired with Masseria's top soldier Charles Lucky Luciano to have Masseria killed. Maranzano emerged as the most powerful mafia boss in the nation, setting up 5 separate criminal groups in New York and calling himself the boss of the bosses, or a phrase you may be more familiar with, the leader of the 5 families. These families included the Bonanos, the Colombos, the Gambinos, the Genovese, and the Lucchese. After Maranzano divided up New York into the 5 families, Lucky Luciano set up the Commission in 1931. The Commission was a governing body of the Mafia where the bosses of the most powerful families would have an equal say and vote on important matters and solve disputes between the families. This brought an era of peace between the different Mafia families. A Mafia family was being established in Chicago during this time after Al Capone and his family massacred the North Side Gang, a group of Irish criminals. Capone, who was nicknamed Scarface, was arrested for tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He died in 1947 after suffering a stroke. Luciano was arrested for running a prostitution ring in 1936 and was sentenced up to 50 years in prison. 10 years later, he was released and sent to Italy, where he would remain for the rest of his life, where he was still an important communicator between the Sicilian Mafia and the American Mafia. After alcohol became legal again, the Mafia decided to branch out into other routes for money. They diversified their activities into illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, extortion, protection rackets, drug trafficking, fencing, and labor racketeering through control of labor unions. And by this point, the different rankings of the Mafia were established. This included associate, soldier, capo, consigliere, underboss, and finally, boss. The Mafia also became involved with Cuban affairs and had business ties with Cuba starting in the 1930s. In fact, in August of 1960, Colonel Sheffield Edwards, director of the Office of Security of the CIA, proposed the assassination of Cuban head of state Fidel Castro by Mafia assassins. Between August of 1960 and April of 1961, the CIA, with the help of the Mafia, pursued a series of plots to poison or shoot Castro. All of these attempts failed, and Castro would outlive almost, if not all, of the people involved. After that, relations with Cuba slowly died down as the golden age of the mob was slowly but surely coming to an end. Two tales that are crucial to the story of the American Mafia are of Jimmy Hoffa and John Gotti. Hoffa was a union activist who served as the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters from 1957 until 1971. At the height of his popularity in the 1960s, the unions he led had over 2.3 million members nationwide. When John F. Kennedy was elected president, he appointed his brother Robert, the Attorney General, to investigate Hoffa and his shady dealings involving the Mafia. Hoffa, in fact, did get involved in the Mafia to help with his rise in power, and when he got convicted of a jury tampering charge, he became an enemy of the Mafia. Richard Nixon commuted his prison sentence in 1971 after serving 4 years behind bars. Hoffa regained some control of the unions and seemed to be getting right back onto his feet. Members of the Mafia were not pleased with Hoffa's decision to try and regain leadership of the union. One of these people was Anthony Provenzano, who was a national vice president of the union during Hoffa's second term as its president. The two had actually been friends for a long time until a reported feud the two had in federal prison sometime in the 1960s. In 1973 and 1974, Hoffa asked him for support to regain his position as the union president, but Provenzano refused and threatened Hoffa by allegedly saying he would pull out his guts and kidnap his children. He seems like a nice guy. Provenzano was a high-ranking member in the New York City Genovese crime family. At least 2 of Provenzano's union opponents had been murdered, and others who spoke out against him had been assaulted. The story goes that Hoffa was supposed to meet with Provenzano at 2 o'clock on July 30th, 1975 in Detroit. 30 minutes later, nobody had arrived, and the now annoyed Hoffa called his wife. A few minutes later, a car pulled out of the restaurant where Hoffa was waiting and nearly hit a truck. The truck driver, who was making deliveries in the area, pulled up next to the car and immediately recognized Jimmy Hoffa sitting in the backseat behind the car's driver. The driver noticed a long object covered with a gray blanket on the seat between Hoffa and the other passenger. He thought that it was a shotgun or a rifle. He also stated that he didn't get a good look at anyone else in the car. This was the last time Hoffa would be seen alive, and as the car drove off, Hoffa would never be heard from again. A police investigation was started after Hoffa's wife reported that Hoffa never came home. Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone, a friend of Provenzano's, were the prime suspects in the case, and as they were the only 2 people in the car with Hoffa. In that same car, police dogs had also found a scent of Hoffa. The 2 stated that they were in New York playing cards with some friends, and the detectives were never able to figure out what happened to Hoffa, and he was pronounced legally dead in 1982. It is highly regarded to this day that it was indeed members of the Mafia who murdered Jimmy Hoffa. The next story is the tale of famous Mafia boss John Gotti. As early as his teenage years, Gotti was running errands for the underbosses of the Gambino crime family. As he grew, his crimes grew as well. He eventually carried out truck hijackings and stole tens of thousands of dollars with the help of the Gambino family. In February of 1968, the FBI had identified Gotti as the man who stole $50,000 worth of cigarettes from the United States Airlines and was sentenced to 3 years behind bars. Over the years, Gambino racked up more crimes and climbed the ranks of the Gambino family throughout the 70s. In December of 1978, Gotti was a part of one of the largest unrecovered cash robberies in history, the famous Lufthansa heist at Kennedy Airport. An estimated $23 million in today's money was stolen, and it is still unknown how involved Gotti really was. On March 18, 1980, Gotti's youngest son, 12-year-old Frank, was run over and killed on a family friend's minibike by a neighbor named John Favara. Frank's death was ruled an accident, but Favara received death threats and was attacked by Gotti's wife Victoria with a baseball bat when he visited Gotti to apologize. On July 28, 1980, Favara was abducted and disappeared and presumed dead. Gotti is widely assumed to have ordered the murder despite him and his family leaving on vacation for Florida 3 days before the murder. This murder raised Gotti's profile even more. On January 15, 1986, Gotti was declared new boss of the Gambino family after he ordered the deaths of the previous bosses. For 12 years, Gotti ran the Gambino crime family. He was able to escape multiple convictions and raked in the profits behind the scenes. The general public began to call Gotti the Teflon Don because charges against Gotti were unable to stick. Gotti had ordered the murders of multiple people throughout his life and was behind one of the most lucrative operations in mob history. But the party came crashing down on December 11, 1990. FBI agents and NYPD detectives raided the Gambino's residence and arrested Gotti along with 2 of his associates. Gotti was charged with 5 different counts of murder, conspiracy to murder, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, bribery, and tax evasion. Gotti was also denied bail after tapes of the FBI bugs were played at pre-trial hearings. The FBI also managed to get Gotti's underboss, Sammy Gravano, to testify against Gotti. During the trial, Gotti called Gravano a junkie and had several outbursts which nearly got him thrown out of the courtroom. After only 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found Gotti guilty on all charges and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and a $250,000 fine. After the trial, James Fox, who was in charge of the New York FBI field office, proclaimed, "The Teflon Don is gone. The Don is covered in Velcro and all the charges stuck." Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998, and 4 years later he died at the age of 61. Gotti's death left the Gambino family decimated. By that point, over half the family's members were behind bars. Getting back to the mob as a whole, during the golden age of the Mafia, the authorities, including former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, denied their existence. The Mafia was so powerful in New York City alone that a majority of new projects and buildings could not be constructed without Mafia approval. It wasn't until the 1950s when the slow demise of the Mafia really began. In 1951, Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver was the first high-ranking member of the government to stand up to the corruption of the Mafia. Kefauver launched an investigation into organized crime and held public hearings, and for the first time in American history, a part of the federal government publicly recognized the existence of the American Mafia. However, a lack of evidence resulted in Congress failing to take any major action. In 1957, police noticed a gathering of luxurious cars in the upstate New York town of Appalachian. This would later be known as the Appalachian Meeting. The police got hold of what was going on and created roadblocks outside of the house where the cars were parked and called for backup. Over 100 Mafia members were attending a meeting inside the house, which was hosted by Vito Genovese. Out of the 100 men, 58 were arrested, including Genovese. 20 of the mobsters were hit with conspiracy to obstruct justice charges and were fined $10,000 each the following year. After this, J. Edgar Hoover, the same dude who said the Mafia wasn't real, was forced to acknowledge their existence. A gigantic breakthrough happened in 1963 when New York mobster Joseph Valachi broke the Omerta, which was the Mafia's code of silence. Valachi became a government informant and revealed the Mafia's structure and customs for the first time ever. After this event, the tide of the war against the Mafia began to turn to the government. In 1970, Congress passed and Richard Nixon signed RICO, which stood for Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. According to a 1992 congressional report, this act allowed the government to, quote, attack criminal enterprises on a broad front, stripping them of their leadership and sources of both illicit and legitimate revenue in one massive prosecution. You see, in the past, mobsters were able to avoid prosecution through legal loopholes, but after RICO was passed, high-ranking mobsters were starting to get convicted. By the 1980s, the use of RICO allowed the FBI to diminish Mafia control over Las Vegas, labor unions, and their political influence. Mafiosos began to testify against fellow mobsters in exchange to avoid prosecution and be enrolled into the Witness Protection Program. After the conviction of John Gotti in the 90s, the American Mafia as a whole began to decline. However, money still came in, and it was estimated by the FBI that as of 2002, the Mafia had earned over $50 to $90 billion a year. The final major crime family to go down was the Bonanno family, when boss Joseph Messina was arrested and indicted along with his associates. The modern-day Mafia has around 3,000 to 5,000 members nationwide and outsources a majority of its work to other criminal groups such as drug cartels and motorcycle gangs to avoid being caught by authorities. In its golden years, this was the hierarchy of the Mafia, which was created by the 5 families back in 1931. Only associates of the Mafia could be any background, while all other members had to be full-blooded Italian Americans. Associates were not members of the Mafia itself, but worked for them nonetheless. Homosexuality was banned from the Mafia entirely, and an example of this was when acting mob boss John D'Amato in the 90s was murdered when he was suspected of engaging in homosexual activity. Well, that about wraps up the history of the mob. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to watch this. I'll have links to my Twitter and Discord in the description below, and as always, I'll see you on the flip side.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. Motherfucking boss.